He had always believed in the idea of the one, not because he was overly romantic, but because deep down he felt incomplete, as if someone out there held the missing piece of his soul. His life, on the surface, seemed full: friends, a decent career, and enough distractions to keep the loneliness at bay. But when the noise faded and he was left alone with his thoughts, there was always an emptiness he couldn't explain. It wasn't that he hadn't met people. He dated, had conversations that stretched into the night, shared fleeting connections that felt promising for a moment. But none of them stayed. None of them felt real. He carried a memory in his heart, buried deep, of a girl he'd met years ago. It wasn't even a love story back then, just a passing moment, a shared glance at a train station, a brief conversation at a friend's party. But there was something about her, a spark that didn't fade like the others. He never got her name, just a faint memory of her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke. That memory haunted him more than he'd admit. It wasn't rational. How could you miss someone you never really knew? But that's the thing about connection. It doesn't always follow logic. One evening, scrolling through old photos on his phone, he stumbled upon a blurry shot from that party. She was in the background, laughing with friends, unaware she was being captured. That image reignited something inside him, a quiet ache that grew louder with each passing day. He decided to find her. It sounded foolish, even to himself. But sometimes, the heart needs closure, whether it finds love or just the end of a chapter. His search wasn't glamorous, no grand adventures, just late nights combing through social media, asking mutual friends vague questions, hoping for a thread to pull. Days turned into weeks, and doubt crept in. Maybe she'd moved away, changed beyond recognition. Or worse, never existed the way he remembered. But fate has a strange way of showing up when you least expect it. One rainy afternoon, as he sat in a small cafe, nursing a coffee more for comfort than caffeine, he looked up, and there she was. Just like that. No dramatic music, no slow motion. She was real, standing a few feet away, flipping through a book, completely unaware of the impact she had just made. His heart raced, not with excitement, but fear. What if she wasn't the person he'd built up in his mind? What if finding her didn't fill the emptiness? But despite the doubts, he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away.
Not now.
Approaching her felt like stepping into a moment he'd imagined 1,000 times, but reality had none of the ease his daydreams promised. His voice was steady, though his heart wasn't, as he introduced himself, mentioning the party from years ago. To his surprise, she remembered. A brief smile, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. It was enough to erase every doubt he'd carried. They talked, effortlessly slipping into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. There was no need for pretense. Words flowed easily, as if they were catching up rather than starting fresh. Days turned into weeks, filled with long conversations, shared coffee cups, and late-night texts that stretched until dawn. They spoke about everything: fears, dreams, the small details of life most people overlook. She had this way of making the ordinary feel extraordinary, as if just being with her colored the world differently. He found himself laughing more, thinking less about the past, and imagining a future where she was a constant. But even in the warmth of their connection, there were moments, small, fleeting, where something felt just out of place. She'd hesitate when certain topics came up, glance away when he asked about her past. He brushed it off as nothing, convincing himself that everyone has shadows they'd rather not revisit. After all, wasn't he the same? Carrying around memories of someone he barely knew, turning them into something bigger than reality? Still, those moments lingered, quiet whispers in the back of his mind. There was one evening when they sat under the stars, sharing stories of childhood dreams. She spoke about wanting to travel, to see places that felt untouched by time. Her voice was filled with longing, but her eyes seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. He noticed but said nothing. He didn't want to ruin the moment with questions that might pull at threads best left untouched. His feelings grew, deep and overwhelming. She became the center of his world, not in an obsessive way, but in that quiet, undeniable manner where her absence felt louder than her presence. But alongside the joy, a small voice whispered doubts. Was he enough for her? She was vibrant, full of life, while he often felt weighed down by his own thoughts. He wondered if she deserved someone better, someone less complicated, less haunted by the fear of not being enough. Yet, every time he saw her smile, every time she reached for his hand without thinking, those fears faded. He told himself love wasn't about perfection, it was about showing up, flaws and all. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, not with her, but with the story he was trying to write in his head. He had found the girl he'd been searching for, but now he wondered if she was searching for something or someone too. It started with something small, a message on her phone that she quickly dismissed when she thought he wasn't looking. Just a name, unfamiliar but somehow out of place. He told himself not to overthink it, but the feeling sat heavy, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Days passed, but that brief moment grew louder in his thoughts, echoing in the silence between their conversations. She hadn't changed, not on the surface. She laughed the same, held his hand with the same warmth, but he noticed things now, pauses that felt longer, smiles that didn't fully reach her eyes. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that love required trust, not suspicion. But curiosity, mixed with fear, can be relentless. One evening, when she left her phone unattended, he glanced, not out of malice, but from a place of quiet desperation. What he found wasn't a betrayal in bold letters, but fragments, messages from someone she claimed was just a friend, filled with words too intimate, too familiar to ignore. It wasn't physical betrayal. It was something worse, emotional threads connecting her to someone else, threads he thought belonged to him alone. His heart didn't shatter instantly. It cracked slowly, piece by piece, as he read words that painted a version of her life he wasn't part of. He didn't confront her right away. Instead, he carried the weight of knowing, trying to find explanations, rewriting stories in his head where it didn't mean what it clearly did. But pretending couldn't drown the truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, steady, a stark contrast to the storm inside him. He asked simple questions, and she gave complicated answers. Her face shifted from surprise to guilt, and with every word, the space between them grew wider. She admitted she was confused, that she cared for him but had unresolved feelings for someone from her past. She hadn't meant to hurt him, she said, as if intentions could erase the pain. Listening to her was like watching the life they'd built together unravel thread by thread. The girl he'd searched for, the one he believed was his missing piece, was standing right there, but she felt further away than ever. He wanted to be angry, to raise his voice, to demand answers that might make sense of it all. But all he felt was hollow. In the quiet that followed, memories flashed. Every moment they'd shared now tainted with doubt. Was any of it real? Or was he just a placeholder, someone to fill the emptiness until she figured out what she truly wanted? He didn't ask those questions. He already knew the answers wouldn't change the truth. When he left, he didn't look back. Not because he didn't care, but because looking back would mean holding on to something already gone. The hardest part wasn't losing her. It was realizing he never truly had her. Days turned into weeks, and the absence of her presence was both a relief and an ache. He thought losing her would break him, but what hurt more was the realization that he'd been holding on to an illusion, an idea of love rather than love itself. The memories lingered, not as cherished moments, but as reminders of how easily reality can be painted over with hope. He found himself revisiting old conversations in his mind, searching for signs he'd missed, clues that might have warned him. But hindsight is always clearer, and regret sharper when it's tied to something you believed in deeply. The pain wasn't dramatic, it was quiet and persistent, like a dull ache that flares up unexpectedly. He'd walk past places they'd been, hear songs they'd listened to together, and feel that familiar weight settle in his chest. But with each passing day, the heaviness grew lighter, not because he forgot her, but because he began to remember himself. She had been the center of his world, but in losing her, he found the parts of himself he'd neglected, the dreams he'd set aside, the passions he dimmed trying to fit into a story that was never his to begin with. There were moments of weakness, of course. Nights when loneliness crept in, whispering temptations to reach out, to hear her voice one last time. But he didn't. Not because he didn't care, but because he knew that healing required distance. Love, he realized, isn't just about holding on. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let go. Slowly, he rebuilt his life, not in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate steps. He reconnected with friends he'd drifted from, picked up hobbies he'd forgotten, and allowed himself to feel without judgment. The emptiness that once felt overwhelming transformed into space for growth, for self-discovery, for peace. He thought about her less with time, not with bitterness, but with a quiet acceptance. She had been a chapter in his story, not the whole book. And though that chapter ended in betrayal, it taught him lessons he wouldn't trade. He learned that love isn't about finding someone to complete you. It's about finding someone who complements you without dimming your own light. One day, as he sat in that same cafe where he'd first seen her again, he realized he no longer looked for her face in every crowd. The ache was gone, replaced by gratitude, for the love, for the lessons, for the growth. He had searched for her, thinking she was the missing piece. But in losing her, he found that the missing piece had always been within himself. And that was the true ending, not of a love story, but of a journey back to who he was meant to be all along.